right. Well, greetings, everyone. It's time for the Bible study. Would you please check the picture, see if I'm
It's fine. Middle.
fine in the middle this time? Okay.
Balanced, colorful.
All right. Today is the, well, what is today anyway? It's the third day of April. Third day of April, and the third day of the Passover festival, and it's the 17th day of Abib,
Correct.
so, or Nisan. So that means it's the second day of the Omer count.
Correct.
Until this evening, when we'll be going into the third day of the Omer count.
Yes.
I'm going to talk about the Omer today, and if my wife will keep track of the time, I want to know when it's 15 minutes have gone by, and then when it's 30 minutes, or 29 minutes, and then I want to start over another 15 minutes, and then 29, 30 minutes, and then the final set. Because we're dividing the Bible study today in I think into 3 portions. It's all going to be on the Omer count, and basically why we do it, how we do it, what it's for, why God commanded it, exactly what did He command us to do, and what is the Omer all about anyway, and why do we call it the Omer?
Yes.
There's a lot of confusion on this issue, a lot of confusion on, seems like, all the laws of God. People are just totally bamboozled, and it's almost like they're into witchcraft because there's so many different opinions, and they are not of God. They are Satan, the devil, is muddying the water and creating strife and friction and argumentation. But the truth is very plain to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, and those to whom God opens their minds to perceive the truth, so they don't follow some wacky idiot or some bamboozling serpent astray. And many people today have gone astray. So to get into the subject of the Omer count and how it relates to Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread and what it counts up to, where it's going, let's just see what the Word of God says first of all, and then study the different historical sources which tell us more information we need to know to pinpoint the truth. So we begin in Leviticus chapter 23, which is a chapter in the Old Testament that talks about the annual holy days, the only chapter really that summarizes them all in from A to Z, you might say. Leviticus chapter 23. Well, God says in verse 2, "Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, the feasts of the Lord." Notice these are Yahweh's feasts. The Lord's feasts, not man's feasts. They're not pagan feasts. These are the feasts that belong to the Lord. Yahweh, God Almighty, the ever-living Creator. And He says, these are the feasts which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. These are my feasts,
Yes.
God says. And the first one He mentions is the weekly Sabbath day. And then He mentions Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And on verse 6 He says, "And on the 15th day of the same month of Abib or Nisan is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord Yahweh. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation and do no customary work." Well, you know, a lot of people think you don't have to eat unleavened bread 7 days. You just have to eat unleavened bread on one day, the first day. But it says right here plainly, 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. God means what He says. His word is pure and perfect. So we're to eat matzah, or unleavened bread, daily for 7 days during this feast. Because the symbol of the feast is to humble ourselves. You don't just humble yourself in one day. We're to afflict ourselves. You don't just afflict yourself and eat the bread of poverty and affliction and accomplish the spiritual purpose in one day. You have to maintain this attitude of spiritual poverty and humility and meekness and yieldedness before God. 7 days, which is a time of completion or perfection. Now notice the commandment then says in verse 9, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land which I give to you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest to the priest. And this is in the spring, obviously, and the first crop to be reaped in the spring is the barley harvest, the barley crop. Verse 11 says that the priest shall wave the sheaf before the Lord Yahweh to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. Day after the Sabbath. What Sabbath? Well, as we're going to see, it's the first Sabbath or day of unleavened bread, or the Passover Sabbath. That's when it's waved, right? The day after the Passover, first day of unleavened bread. And then it goes on to say, You shall offer on that day, when you wave the sheaf, a male lamb of the first year, without blemish, as a burnt offering to the Lord. And when they had the temple, of course, that was part of the ritual. And verse 14 says, You shall not eat bread or grain, nor fresh grain, until the same day that you have brought this offering, this wave sheaf, first fruits offering, to your God. It should be a statute forever throughout your generations and all your dwellings. So this is a pretty important day. This is a day you start counting, and verse 15 says, You shall count for yourselves from the day after that Sabbath, the day after that Passover, first holy day, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, beginning with that second day of Passover week, or Passover, the days of unleavened bread, you shall count 7 Sabbaths or weeks shall be completed. And the word there in the New King James says Sabbaths, but the Jewish translation, the Tanakh, and many others, says weeks, 7 weeks. And we'll see why it's weeks there, and why that's the proper way to understand it. And notice 7 weeks shall be completed, or 7 complete weeks, not partial weeks. Now, how do you count 7 complete Sabbaths? The Sabbath is from sunset to sunset. And you're counting 7 Sabbaths. What do you mean 7 complete Sabbaths? It's kind of a mystery how you would even call that complete. You mean you count 6 and then part of the 7th?
No.
And that would be incomplete? Anyway, the meaning there is weeks, as we're going to see. So now the command is to count this time. Now in Deuteronomy chapter 16, this command is repeated. Deuteronomy 16 talks about the Passover being kept in the month of Abib, and 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And in verse 9 he says, You shall count 7 weeks. Now here the word is very clearly weeks. In the Hebrew it's Shavuot. Shavua is week, and Shavuot is the plural, or weeks. And God says, You shall count 7 weeks. Not Sabbath days, but weeks. For yourself, again. This is a ritual or a commandment we are to do for our own benefit. It's for ourselves. God has given this to us to help us. And we'll see why and how it helps us later. It's a very important spiritual law and spiritual principle. So we're to count 7 weeks, Shavuot. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain, to the barley harvest, the first fruits. Then, after the 7 weeks are counted, verse 10 says, you shall keep the feast of weeks. Or again, in Hebrew, it's the feast of Shavuot. Now notice, it's not the feast of Sabbaths, or Shabbatot, it's the feast of Shavuot. It's a very clear distinction. It's not the feast of counting Sabbath days. It's the feast of counting weeks. And that's why the terms Shavua and Shavuot are used. So this explains the real meaning when it says you shall count 7 Sabbaths in Leviticus 23, and it's talking about, as Deuteronomy 16 shows, 7 weeks. Now, why did they use the word Sabbath in Leviticus 23? Well, because the Sabbath stands for a week. Because the Sabbath is the 7th day of a week, of the week, and so it stands for a week, and a week is 7 days. So you count 7 weeks for yourself, counting 7 sevens. 7 sevens equals 49 days. And then the next day is Pentecost. As it says, then you shall keep the feast of weeks after you complete the count to Shavuot. And Shavuot's also called Pentecost. And Pentecost is a Greek word, and that means 50th day. So you count 7 times 7 days is 49 days, and then the next day is the 50th day, which equals and is Pentecost. And we're to keep the Feast of Weeks then, with a tribute of a free will offering at that time. And I'm not going to go any further than that at the moment. But there's a lot of controversy today in the churches of God about when do you start counting, and why is there this controversy? What is the cause of it? Well, it goes back to the Worldwide Church of God and Herbert Armstrong, and he was just beginning to learn various things after his wife was converted to keeping the Sabbath day, and then Herbert tried to challenge her because he could not see how all these churches could be wrong. And so he began to investigate to see that, well, the Bible must show that Sunday is the day to worship because all the churches keep Sunday. And he was angry, and he wanted to prove her wrong. He didn't want this fanaticism in his home. And he searched into it, and he was humbled because he found out she was right. And the Bible teaches observing the Sabbath day over and over and over. It mentions the Sabbath and hardly ever mentions the first day of the week. And certainly not as a day of worship, just as a time reference. So he had to admit he was wrong, and he had to eat crow and apologize. But then he wanted to prove whether the Bible was even God's word or not. But why should we do anything, unless it's God's word? So he began to investigate the theory of evolution. And he proved in very careful Bible study that there is a God. There is a great creator. They used the analogy of the watchmaker. If you walk through the forest and you look down and see a shiny object on the ground, and you pick it up and you see, wow, look at that, it's a Rolex watch. Gold and silver and beautiful timepiece, a watch. And you lift it up to your ear and it's ticking. And the second hand is moving. And so you think to yourself, if you're an evolutionist, well, that watch just kind of put itself together, and all the dirt and crud and all the silver and gold and everything just kind of fashioned itself, and it just kind of miraculously came together and made a beautiful watch. That's the theory of evolution. Because the whole universe is like a huge watch, with the planets orbiting the sun, and the sun going around in the Milky Way galaxy, and all the stars are part of this great celestial timepiece. And so it's the old analogy of a man in England years ago said, well, you cannot have a watch unless you have a watchmaker. That watch tells you something. It tells you there had to be a maker who created and made that watch. How much more does there have to be a maker or creator to make the universe? This great universal timepiece all around us, with the sun going around the earth from east to west, and the moon circling the earth, and the earth circling the sun in its orbit, and all the other planets. It's like a great celestial timepiece. And there had to be a maker of this timepiece, this great watch in the heavens. So, God is the one who ordained time. God is the one who set forth his Sabbath days to be observed. Every seventh day is a Sabbath. And there's 7 days in a week. 6 days, God says, you shall labor and do your work. And then on the seventh day, you're to rest. Then God also set in motion the annual Sabbath days based upon the new moons of the months. Because every new moon in God's calendar is a new month. The Hebrew word Kodesh means new moon, and it also means new month, or a month. So the month then begins with the new moon. And then you count the days of the month, and the 15th day of Nisan is the day of the Passover. And the first day of unleavened bread. The 14th day is the day that called the preparation of the Passover, when the lambs are slain and the leaven is put out. And the 15th day is the day of the Passover. And the very next day, then the 16th day, is the day of the wave sheaf offering, which is the day after the Sabbath of the Passover. And then you count 50 days and you come to Pentecost. Now, I want to give you some evidence of that. First, I'm going to open up the Septuagint, which is a translation of the original Torah into the Greek language 250 years before Christ, before there was a Sadducee or a Pharisee per se, because they developed in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabee brothers about 167 BC, which is about 100 years later. So in the days of King Philadelphus of Egypt, he asked the Jewish Sanhedrin to give him a copy of the Torah in Greek, because he wanted to have all the great books of the world in his library at Alexandria, Egypt. And so they were inspired to put together the book of the Greek Torah, the Greek version of the Torah. And in that translation, in Leviticus chapter 23, God says, well, let me get to chapter 23 here. Verse 5, in the first month of the 14th day of the month, between the evenings, Ben Ha'arbaim in the Hebrew, which means in the late afternoon and evening up part of the day, as Jeremiah says, as the shadows are lengthening, which means the sun is starting to go down toward the western horizon, is the Lord's Passover. So that's when the Passover lambs were killed. And on the 15th day, beginning at sunset, is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. So they kill the lambs in the afternoon and then roast them in the rest of the afternoon. So they're ready to eat them at the first meal of the first day of the feast. That's the feast. It begins on the 15th day of Nisan. And that's the feast of unleavened bread. In 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread. Verse 7 says, and the first day shall be a holy convocation to you, and no servile or normal regular work shall be done. Now, going down to verse 9, God says, "Speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, when you enter into the land which I give you and reap the harvest of it, then you shall bring a sheaf." And the Hebrew word there is Omer or sheaf, "of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And he shall lift up the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you." And he'd wave it before the Lord at the tabernacle. Then it says, now pay close attention to this, "On the morrow of the first day, the priest shall lift it up." So what day did they do the wave sheaf offering? Was it the day after the weekly Sabbath? No, the day after the morrow after the first day of the feast. The first day of the feast is when it was given. Or in other words, the 16th of Nisan, or Abib. Then, in verse 15, he says, "And you shall number to yourselves from the day after the Sabbath," that's the Passover Sabbath, that's when they offered the wave sheaf, "from the day in which you shall offer the sheaf of the heave offering, 7 full weeks." See, the word complete means full. 7 full weeks. That means, you know what that means, 7 full weeks. Not 7 partial weeks. And not 7 Sabbaths, but 7 weeks. Shall be full, complete. Which means 49 days. "Until the morrow of the last week, you shall number 50 days." So 7 weeks is 49 days, and the next day is the 50th day, or Pentecost. "And then you shall bring a new meal offering to the Lord." And it goes on to give the instructions for celebrating Pentecost. So that is from the Septuagint. What did the Jews do in Jesus' day? How did they count to Pentecost? When did they begin the Omer count? When did they wave the wave sheaf offering? Well, a very powerful book and witness in this regard is the book of Josephus. Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, which Josephus was a great Jewish general and a priest and a Pharisee that lived in the days of the apostles and in the days of Christ. And he fought in the war against the Romans in 70 A.D. and later was taken prisoner. Josephus tells us in his Antiquities of the Jews how they counted Pentecost. And in Antiquities of the Jews, book 3, chapter 10, and part 5, toward the bottom of this long paragraph, he says, "On the second day of unleavened bread, which is the 16th day of the month of Nisan, they first partake of the first fruits of the earth. And before that day they do not touch them." They can't touch the new harvest of barley until something is done on the 16th day of Nisan, or Abib. So he says, "On the second day of unleavened bread, which is the 16th day of Nisan, they first partake of the fruits of the earth. For before that day they do not touch them. In the first place they offer the first fruits of their barley, and that in the manner following. They take a handful of the ears of barley and dry them and beat them small and purge the barley from the bran. They then take a 1/10 deal of it to the altar to God, and they cast a handful of it upon the fire, where it's purged and purified, you might say, and they leave the rest for the use of the priest. And after this it is that they may publicly or privately begin to reap the harvest of the new year. They also at this time of the participation of the first fruits of the earth sacrificed a lamb as a burnt offering to the Lord. In part 6 then, paragraph 6 says, when a week of weeks has passed over after this sacrifice, a week of weeks, notice, 7 weeks is passed over the sacrifice, which is on the 16th day of Nisan, the 2nd day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He says, which weeks contain 49 days. On the 50th day, which is Pentecost, but is called by the Hebrews as Sartha, which signifies Pentecost, they bring to God a loaf made of wheat flour, of 2/10 deals with leaven, etc. And those are the offerings for Pentecost. Well, that's a pretty powerful testimony of when they offer the Omer and when they begin the count to Pentecost. That's the Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews. Now the next source we're going to read from is the testimony of the works of Philo. Philo was a strong, well-known, powerful Jewish philosopher, teacher of the time of Christ and Peter, who lived in Alexandria, Egypt. And Philo tells us what the Jewish custom was. In his book, he says in the Decalogue, page 532, speaking of the sheaf of corn, which is offered an offering of gratitude and for the fertility and productiveness of the plain of Israel, as exhibited in the fullness of the years of corn, and the day of Pentecost, which is numbered from this day by 7 portions of 7 days, when they offer up loaves to the Lord. And later on, Philo says, on page 583, about the Passover feast, and then he says there is also a festival on the day after the Passover feast, or after the 15th of Nisan, which succeeds the first day, and this is named the sheaf, the day of the wave sheaf, and it succeeds the first day. It's right after the first day. From what takes place on it? For the sheaf is brought to the altar as a first fruit, both of the country which the nation has received for its own, and also for the whole land, and as an offering both for the nation separately, and as a common one for the whole race of mankind. This is the first fruit, and it's the day after the Passover, first day of the Passover feast. And on page 584, he says, the solemn assembly for the occasion of the festival of the sheaf, having such great privileges, is the prelude to another festival of still greater importance. For from this day the 50th day is reckoned, making up the sacred number of 7 sevens, with the addition of a unit as a seal to the whole, and this festival being that of the first fruits of the corn, or Pentecost, Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, also called HaBikurim, the day of first fruits to the Hebrews. It's derived its name, he says, of Pentecost from the number 50. So I think that's pretty plain on how to count Pentecost, brethren. We count from the 2nd day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So says Josephus, so says Philo, these ancient testimonials, but there's so much more evidence. So, why do so many people today count Pentecost from the weekly Sabbath that falls during the days of unleavened bread. Why do people do that? Why do churches do that? Where did they get off the track? Where did they go overboard? Where did they must have hit black ice, and just skidded right off the road. Skidded right off the road, over the cliff, down the cliff, and into the chasm below. And so they failed to obey God. But let's look at some real scientific scholarly evidence on counting Pentecost. Why did some not do it the way that I've just described? Well, the story goes back to the days of Christ and the days of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and later the Karaite Jews. What happened was, and we'll read about this in the book by Alfred Edersheim called The Temple, its Ministry and Services, an excellent book for knowledge about the ancient customs of Israel. And Alfred Edersheim writes in a chapter on the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Day of Pentecost. And there's a section here on page 203 called The Sheaf of the First Fruits. It talks about the evening after the first day of unleavened bread, or the 15th of Nisan or Abib, as the sun sets. He says, a little later on in the evening of that same day, which by now is the 16th of Nisan beginning, just as it was growing dark, a noisy throng followed delegates from the Sanhedrin outside the city and across the brook Kidron at Jerusalem. It was a very different procession, and they'd go out to the field there and cut down the first fruits. He says, the law had it, you shall bring a sheaf, literally the Omer, of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And ye shall wave the Omer before the Lord Yahweh or Jehovah to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. The Passover Sabbath. Because the Passover day is a Sabbath day. And he says, until then, not until this offering was done, could fresh barley be used and sold in the land. Now this Passover sheaf was reaped in public the evening before it was offered. The expression, the morrow after the Sabbath, he says, has sometimes been misunderstood as implying that the presentation of the so-called first sheaf of the barley, the Omer, was to always be made on the day following the weekly Sabbath of the Passover week. He said, this view, adopted by the Boethusians, which was the house of the high priest of the Sadducees, and the Sadducees in the time of Christ, and by Karaite Jews and certain others, certain modern interpreters, rests on a misinterpretation of the word Sabbath, as in analogous allusions to other festivals in the same chapter, Leviticus chapter 23. The word Sabbath or Shabbatot means not only the weekly Sabbath, but the day of the festival. The annual festivals are also called Sabbath days. These are the testimony of Josephus and Philo, and the Jewish tradition leaves no room to doubt that in this instance we are to understand by the Sabbath the 15th of Nisan, on whatever day of the week it might fall. Already on the 14th day of Nisan, the spot whence the first sheaf was to be reaped had been marked out by the delegates, but tying together some of the stalks in bundles, where the barley was going to be cut down. Then on the evening of the 15th, even though it was a Sabbath day, they'd go out to that field as the sun went down. 3 men and went out each with a sickle and a basket, and set to work. But to point out that this was the date to do it,
Yes, sir.
the Jews in Jerusalem and the rabbis would have all the people come out there with them to watch the ceremony.
Yes, sir.
So they, to instill it in their brain
Yes, sir.
that this was the right time.
Wow.
So when they went down there, they'd ask the bystanders standing around watching 3 times each of these questions. Has the sun gone down? They'd ask 3 times. People would all say, yes, yes, it's down. And then they'd say, with this sickle, and hold up the sickles in their hand. And the people would say, yes, yes, with that sickle. And then they'd say, into this basket, and they'd show them the baskets they had. Say, yes, yes, into the basket. And they'd say, on this Sabbath, on this day, even if it was the end of the Passover day, even if it was the Passover day. The beginning of the 15th of Nisan was a holy day, a Sabbath day. Even on this Sabbath day. And they'd say, yes, yes, even now. And then finally they would say, shall I reap? Shall I reap? And all the congregation would say, yes, reap, reap. And once that's been affirmed, they cut down the barley to the amount of 1 ephah, or 10 omers, or 3 seahs, which is equal to about 3 pecks and 3 pints of our English measure. The ears were then brought into the court of the temple and thrashed out with canes or stalks so as not to injure the barley, the grain. And then there was parched on a pan perforated with holes so that each grain might be touched by the fire and finally exposed to the wind. The barley was then thus prepared was ground in a barley mill, which left the hulls whole. According to some authorities, the flour was always successfully passed through 13 sieves, each closer than the previous one, to make the barley meal, very fine, a very fine flour. Thus he says, though 1 ephah, or 10 omers of barley was cut down, only 1 omer of flour, or about 5 pints of our measure, was offered in the temple on the 2nd day of the Passover, or the 16th day of Nisan. The rest of the flour might be redeemed and used for any purpose. So there we have it from Edersheim again. More solid evidence and proof beyond contradiction of when you start counting to Pentecost and when the barley wave sheaf offering was done, on the 16th day of the month of Nisan, or Abib. Now in another book, Jewish festival book called Celebrate, the Complete Jewish Holidays Handbook by Leslie Copham and Ross, on this subject of the Omer, we have another fuller explanation, and if I can find it here, okay. It says a harvest holiday on page 110. One of the special occasions was Shavuot, which is Pentecost. Or the Feast of First Fruits, Bikurim. He says there was one minor technical problem in keeping Pentecost, or Shavuot, and unlike every other Jewish festival, this date, the Torah specifies no fixed date. It simply says to count 7 complete weeks. You know, that makes it a little technical difficulty. Well, how do you know what day? You got to therefore know what day to start the count. He writes, the first sheaf was to be offered, quote, after the Sabbath, unquote, connected with the Passover, Leviticus 23, verse 11. Identifying what after the Sabbath meant was a point of contention between two philosophical branches within Judaism, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But later on, the start of the 7-week count is even less precise. In Deuteronomy 16:9 it says, when the sickle is first put to the standing grain, since the start of the harvest depends on when the barley ripens. So the indefinite timing makes sense. You have to get the year started right, and that all depends upon when the grain becomes Abib, because the first month of the year is named Abib, or Aviv, which means the month of ripening grain, meaning the barley grain. Then the same authority goes on saying, the legacy of the Pharisees, who identified the first day of the Omer as Nisan 16, served them well. This is page 112 of the book. Through a process of interpretation of the time markers in Exodus 19 and comparison of certain phrases in that text with similar phrases in other parts of the Bible, the rabbis determined that the revelation at Mount Sinai had taken place on Sivan 6, 50 days after Passover, 50 days after the first count of the Omer, or in other words, on the same day as Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost. That was the date that the law of God, the 10 Commandments, was given on Mount Sinai. So this put even further importance on keeping the day. It represents the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, historically. Now, if you count from the Sunday during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you're going to have a different date every year, because you're just counting from Sunday, and that can be any day of the week. I'm sorry. You always end up on a Sunday then, but not the date of the giving of the law, because the law was given 50 days from the second day of Passover, counting that as day one. And if you have to wait till the weekly Sabbath, which can occur any time during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you might have to wait 7 days. So there'll be no connection between Pentecost and the Decalogue or giving of the commandments in that case. But with the way the Pharisees and the Jews counted, it was the date of the giving of the law. So then he says seven, the number 7. There's further evidence of this, that the date was 50 days after the Passover. The other evidence is in the root of the word Shavuot, which is weeks, which is the name of the feast. Shavuot. Shavua means week, and comes from the word Shiva, which means 7. 7 is a holy number, a number signifying perfection, the highest level of attainment in the material sphere, after which we are beyond the limits of earthly time. 7 days rounded out creation and form a week. 7 years make a sabbatical cycle of years. 7 times 7 years comprises the Jubilee cycle, and the 50th year is a Jubilee year. And Shavuot then arrives at the end of a period of 7 times 7 weeks, or 49 days. Derived from the same root as Shavua, the word Shavua means taking a vow. So it also pictures taking a vow, committing yourself with a vow. The Talmud tractate named Shavuot is not about this holiday, but about taking vows or oaths. At Sinai, God and Israel did what? They exchanged vows. Israel took an oath to obey God, and God took an oath to take them as his people at Mount Sinai when he gave them his commandments, and they entered into a covenant, an I do covenant, a marriage covenant, which is taking an oath. Shavuah. Now the period of counting the Omer, he says, took on a new meaning as the spiritual link between the Exodus and the revelation at Sinai came to be known, with Shavuot then providing a finale to the Exodus paradigm. The feast began with the Passover, and then it goes until counting the Omer leads us up to the finale, the end, or Shavuot, which is considered to be the 8th day of Passover. Because Passover week is 7 days, and the next holy day is Shavuot, so it became known as the 8th day of Passover because of the strong linkage between the two. And that's only true if you start counting to Shavuot from the 2nd day of Passover. Not if it varies every year, because you're just disconnected and just starting the day after a weekly Sabbath day, which has no real connection, so to speak, with the Passover holiday itself. And Shavuot then represents the conclusion of the march to freedom. Passover, we begin the march to freedom with God delivering us with supernatural miracles by the finger of God and the hand of God, or the fist of God, on his enemies. And then it concludes at Shavuot with a marriage ceremony where God marries Israel. So we have the picture then of God marrying Israel 50 days after Passover. And so Shavuot then is the conclusion of the march to freedom. It is the concluding feast of liberty, where our liberation process becomes completed with the marriage to the Lord and with the covenant vow between God and Israel. Then they become his people. They become one, as long as they obey him and live according to the covenant. And that is true freedom. So freedom begins with the Passover and ends with Shavuot, which is true freedom. How can we be free unless we are connected to God? You know, it's a very vital thing, our freedom. So now we understand that the counting the Omer is very important, and it begins with the 2nd day of Passover. And now in another book called The Essence of the Holy Days by Abraham Yaakov Finkel, we talk about counting the Omer again on page 162. On page 163, the significance of the Omer count. And he says, when Moses announced to the people of Israel that after their liberation they would become God's servants on Mount Sinai, they asked Moses, well, when will that service take place? And Moses said, after 50 days. Thereupon each person counted the days in eager anticipation of this great event. Remember, the command was that you shall count 7 weeks for yourselves. So each person was commanded to do the count, not just the priest, not just the minister, but each individual person was commanded to count the Omer 7 weeks, 7 days a week, or 49 days until the final day of Pentecost. because they're eagerly looking forward to that great event. He says Shavuot is the day on which the Torah was given. To accentuate the importance of that day, we count the days from Passover until Shavuot. You can compare it with a man who is waiting for his best friend to arrive. He will count the days. He will count even the hours until their reunion. The same applies to the Omer count from Passover until Shavuot. By linking the two festivals together through the act of counting, we declare that receiving the Torah was the purpose and fulfillment of the Exodus. God did not deliver his people from Egypt just for them to go wild in the desert and do whatever seemed right in their own eyes. He delivered them for a purpose, to bring them to him, into union with him, into unity and oneness of spirit and action, through obedience and through the Torah and through contact with God himself as their Redeemer, Provider, Protector, and Defender. So this was one of the main reasons for counting the Omer. And this is the reason we count the Omer today, because we are looking forward to the great marriage of the Lamb with the church, Christ with his first fruits people, our brethren. And Pentecost typifies that great celestial marriage when Christ will marry the church and come back to this earth and redeem the church. And we rise up to meet him in the air, and there will be a great marriage supper, as it says in Revelation chapter 19. After the bride has made herself ready. And what does the bride have to do to make herself ready? Purge out the sin. Get rid of the selfishness and the envy and the jealousy and the wickedness and the disobedience and the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride and arrogance of life. We're to become pure and holy without blemish, as Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5, so that we can meet Christ at his coming and be in the marriage with the Lamb. Counting the days, then, is a sevenfold cycle. 7 times 7 equals 49. And as we come out of Egypt, Israel came out of Egypt, they got further and further away from Egypt and closer to God and his ways, until they were ready to meet him and marry him in the desert. Now in the book of our heritage by Eliyahu Ketov, there's some things at this point I want to mention about the feast of counting the Omer up until the feast of Shavuot or Pentecost. And in the book 2 from Adar to Nisan, which includes the Passover and the Omer count, he writes and says, interestingly, this is the only source in the Tanakh. This is page 691, talking about the beginning of counting the Omer. He talks about the ceremony out in the field when they're cutting down the first fruits of barley in front of all the people. And they, like he says, they ask, shall I reap? And the people say, reap. In each question, he says, an answer was repeated 3 times. Why did they do this? Because of those Jews, the Sadducees, who had strayed from the fold of Israel during the time of the Second Temple. For they said that when the Torah said on the morrow of the Sabbath, it was referring to the day after the weekly Sabbath, or i.e. Sunday, rather than the day after the festival Sabbath, or the Passover day. Passover feast day. So our tradition is, he said, that the reference is not to the weekly Sabbath day, but to the festival. And this was seen in the prophets and the Sanhedrin of every generation who brought the Omer on the 16th of Nisan. The Torah states in Numbers 23, or Leviticus 23 rather, 14, you shall not eat bread or parched grain or green grain until this day. In the book of Joshua, chapter 5 and verse 11, we read, and they ate from the produce of the land from the morrow after the Passover. Interestingly, he says this is the only source in the Tanakh where the 15th of Nisan is referred to as Passover. Were you to say that Passover that year fell on a weekly Sabbath, as the fools, i.e. the Sadducees, conjectured, how was it possible that the permission to eat new grains would be made dependent by the Torah upon something totally unrelated, that is, the day of the week, on pure happenstance? Rather, since this, the eating of the new grain, was made dependent upon the morrow after the Passover, it is obvious that the morrow of the Passover is the reason why new grains are permitted, and we pay no attention to the day of the week. Because it does say very clearly in interpreting this, in Joshua 5 verse 11, they ate from the produce of the land from the day after or morrow after the Passover. Not after the weekly Sabbath day, but the day after the Passover was eaten and celebrated. So there is another proof positive or strong indication, linkage, between the Passover and the beginning of the count of the Omer and the freedom then, as they waved the wave sheaf offering on the day after Passover, and then they could eat of the produce and the grains of the land. They didn't have to wait. So that's in the book by Eliyahu Katav about counting the Omer. And then he quotes Rabbi Yochanan, who says the mitzvah of the Omer should never be taken lightly. That is, the commandment to count the Omer should never be taken lightly. For it was because of the mitzvah of the Omer that Abraham merited to inherit the land of Canaan. For why did God allow him to be given the land of Canaan? For what purpose? He said, so that you might keep my covenant. Genesis 17, verses 8 through 10. Which covenant was that? The covenant to keep the Omer. That's part of God's covenant. Counting the Omer is part of God's commandment. And that's part of the covenant. We don't do it, we break the covenant. He tells the story later on in the days of Haman and the kingdom of Persia, when Mordecai saw Haman approaching him leading a horse. And he said to himself, it would seem to me that this wicked man is only coming to kill me. Mordecai's students were seated in front of him at that time, and he told them, stand up and flee, lest you be burned in my fire. And they said, whether we're killed or not, we stand by you and we will not abandon you. So what did Mordecai do? He wrapped himself in a talit and prayed while his students sat and studied. And Haman came up to them and said, what are you studying? And they replied, the students replied, we're studying the mitzvah of the Omer.
Yeah.
That Israel would offer on this day in the temple. So this was the second day of Passover. And he told them, this Omer, well, what was it made of? Gold or silver? And they said, it's made of barley, cheap grain. And he said, well, what was its value? 10 kantarin, or a great sum of money? And they answered, oh, far less, 10 maut, 10,000. Haman said, "Arise, and have no fear, for your 10,000 have overcome my 10,000 kikars of silver that I pledged to the treasury for the right to annihilate the Jews." God can conquer all enemies with just a pint of the Omer. God can conquer the enemies, but we wave the Omer before the Lord, waving the Omer like a flag. And God says, "Those are my people. Those are my those are my first fruits to the Lord." And that's the story of one of the reasons why we wave the Omer. It's an essential part of God's covenant and contract with his people. He says, "You shall count for yourselves the days until Pentecost," looking forward to that tremendous revelation on Pentecost or Shavuot. So why do so many people then ignore these facts and want to follow the Karaites or the Sadducees and say, well, you count Pentecost from the day after the weekly Sabbath during unleavened bread? Why do they do that? Well, I guess you might say it's tradition. It's just something they've fallen into and they just don't understand, and that's what their ministers kept telling them, and they just don't get it. They just don't quite put it all together. But the Bible shows us, and history shows us, that the Karaites, the Sadducees, were wrong. You know, in Matthew chapter 21, Jesus Christ tells us, Matthew chapter 22, I guess it is actually, it says the Sadducees came to talk to him and interrogate him. The Sadducees came to Christ and said, look, there were with us 7 brothers, and one had married and then he died and had no children. So he left his wife to his brother, and then he died and had no children, and then the wife was left to the 3rd down to the 7th brother. Finally married this woman, and then finally she died and there were no children. So they said to Christ with a snicker and a sneer, well, which one will she be married to in the resurrection? Who is she really married to? Out of the 7, they all had her to wife. And then Jesus answered, it says in verse 29, to these Sadducees, he said to them, you are mistaken. You are in error. The word there in the Hebrew is you are deceived, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God. See, they didn't understand. In the resurrection, he says, people don't marry and they're not given in marriage. There's not going to be marriage and people marrying after they're resurrected, but they're going to be like the angels of God. They're going to be spirit beings, not physical flesh. So Muhammad and all of his followers can forget about 70 virgins waiting for them in the kingdom. There won't be any 70 virgins in the kingdom for them to play around with. There won't be any sex in the kingdom as such. There will be pleasures beyond our understanding and delight, but there won't be marriage. That's for this life, and that's for the flesh. But what was the matter with these Pharisees and these Sadducees? They were deceived, he says, and don't know the Scriptures. And they're the ones that tell us to count from the Omer from the Sunday during the days of unleavened bread. And all the churches today all the churches today and the Messianic Jews, most of them, follow the Sadducees. They are deceived and they're following straight into error. They hit the slippery black ice and they've plummeted off of the road and crashed and probably turned over 2 or 3 times and they landed in the ditch. That's where they are. Now let's look at Unger's Bible Dictionary on the subject, under the subject of festivals, and about the Omer and counting the Pentecost, and the offering of the barley sheaf. In Unger's Bible Dictionary, under festivals, on page 353, it says barley sheaf. This is during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It says, on the second feast day, the 16th of Nisan, the first sheaf of the new harvest barley was symbolically offered to the Lord by waving, not burned on the altar, accompanied by a lamb of the first year for a burnt offering. It was waved before the Lord. And then, on page 355, second column, it says, the 16th day of Nisan, cutting the barley sheaf. This day was also called the morrow after the Sabbath, and on it the Omer of the first produce of the harvest, i.e. barley, was waved before the Lord. Leviticus 23, 10 through 14. Though for obvious reasons it was customary to choose barley grown in the sheltered Ashes Valley across the Kidron River, or valley, there were no restrictions save that the barley was to be grown in Palestine and without being forced by manuring and artificial watering. It had to grow naturally, so to grow at the right season. On the 14th of Nisan, the delegates had marked out the spot where the first sheaf was going to be cut by tying it together in bundles while still standing. When the time came for the cutting of the sheaf, that is, the evening of the 15th of Nisan, even if it were a Sabbath, just as the sun went down, 3 men, each with a sickle and a basket, set formally to work. In order to bring out all the distinctiveness in the ceremony, they asked the questions which I mentioned earlier, and all the people replied, and then they cut down the stalks of barley and took them back to the temple that the grain might be crushed. The grain was then parched in a pan perforated with holes so that each grain might be touched by the fire and finally exposed to the wind. It was then ground and sifted to the requisite fineness, which was ascertained by one of the treasurers plunging his hand into it. The sifting process continued as long as any flour adhered to his hand. In this manner the prescribed omer of flour was secured and offered in the temple on the 16th of Nisan. And then they began the count to Pentecost. Then on page 356 he says, the Jews, at least as early as the days of Christ, connected with the Passover and commemorated on the 6th of Sivan, the giving of the Decalogue. It was made out from Exodus chapter 19 that the law was delivered on the 50th day after the Exodus. The Pentecost was essentially linked to the Passover, that festival which above all others expressed the fact of a race chosen and separated from other nations, and was the solemn termination of the consecrated period. That is, Pentecost was a solemn termination of the consecrated Passover spring festival. The time of the festival. The time was fixed as the 50th day from the morrow after the Sabbath of the Passover. In Deuteronomy 16 verse 9 it shows 7 full weeks after the sickle was put to the corn. And then he says the precise meaning of the word Sabbath in this connection which determines the date for celebration of Pentecost, has been from time immemorial a matter of dispute, as we've seen. The Malthusians and the Sadducees in the time of the Second Temple and the Karaites have taken Sabbath to mean the seventh day of the week, and they maintain the Omer was offered on the day following the weekly Sabbath, or Sunday. This would make Pentecost always come on a Sunday, first day of the week, the day of the sun god. Every year they'd be worshiping on the day of the sun god, Baal, if you count with that counting and that reckoning. Then the Angus Bible Dictionary goes on and says, against this theory, this hypothesis, this argument, many arguments are presented showing that such an opinion involves many arbitrary and improbable arrangements. Commenting on the passage in Leviticus 23, Kiel and Deutsch commentary says that the word Sabbaths in verse 15 signifies weeks. Consequently, the morrow after the seventh Sabbath means the day after the seventh week, not the seventh Sabbath. He said, it is therefore evident that the Jews who during the Second Temple kept Pentecost 50 days after the 16th of Nisan rightly interpreted the injunction in Leviticus 23, verses 15 through 22. The 50th day, according to the Jewish reckoning, may fall on the 5th, 6th, or 7th day of Sivan. And that's because the Jewish calendar, the original calendar of the Jews, the months could vary between either 29 or 30 days. And so if Nisan only had 29 days, and if Iyar only had 29 days, and you're counting 50 days to Shavuot, you'd wind up on Sivan 7. If Nisan had 30 days and Iyar had 30 days, and you counted to Shavuot, you'd wind up on Sivan 5. But in the average year, you wind up on Sivan 6. So that's the explanation of that. Now in this commentary by Kiel and Delitzsch, commentary on the Old Testament, I want to thank one of our brethren for sending me this whole set, this volume. They explain about this counting of the Omer to Shavuot, and I want to share that with you. This is Leviticus chapter 23 in the commentary, multi-volume by Kiel and Delitzsch. And this is, it's volume 1 on the Torah. And it's page 613. Same page as the number of mitzvah in the law, 613 commandments in the law, and this is page 613. And he says here about the Feast of Matzah and the counting of the Omer, page 613. When the Israelites had come into the land to be given to them by the Lord, and had reaped the harvest, they were to bring a sheaf of firstfruits of their harvest to the priest, that he might wave it before Jehovah on the day after the Sabbath, i.e., after the first day of Matzah. According to Josephus and Philo, it was a sheaf of barley. This is taken for granted because in Canaan the harvest began with the barley. Then he says down below, Mikarat HaShabbat, the phrase, the morrow after the Sabbath, signifies the next day after the first day of the Feast of not the day of the Sabbath, which fell in the 7 days feast of Matzah, as the Boethusians supposed, and still less the 22nd day of Nisan, or the day after the conclusion of the 7 days of the feast, which always closed with the Sabbath, or holy day. Then they say, page 614, the Sabbath does not mean the 7th day of the week, but the day of rest, although the weekly Sabbath was always the 7th or last day of the week. Hence, not only the 7th day of the week, but the Day of Atonement, the 10th day of the 7th month, is also called Sabbath, and Shabbaton, as a day of rest on which no laborious work was to be performed. The first day of the Feast of Matzah is also called Sabbath, irrespective of the day of the week upon which it fell. Like the other annual holy days, they're all Sabbath days. Those are days of rest. So he says the morrow after the Sabbath, quote unquote, is equivalent to the morrow after the Passover, mentioned in Joshua 5, verse 11, where Passover signifies the day at the beginning of which the Passover meal was held, i.e., the first day of unleavened bread, which commenced on the evening of the 14th of Nisan, in other words, the 15th of Nisan or Abib. By offering the sheaf of first fruits to the Lord their God, the Israelites were to consecrate their daily bread to the Lord their God, and practically to acknowledge that they owed the blessing of the harvest, the entire harvest, to the grace of God. They were not to eat any bread or any roasted grains of the new crop until they presented this offering to the Lord. This offering was fixed for the 2nd day of the Feast of the Passover, directly tied into the Passover. It was not just an arbitrary weekly Sabbath day that they counted from, but the Passover Sabbath day. Then it says later on at the bottom of this page, the law for the special observance of the Feast of Harvest, that is Pentecost, is added here without any fresh introductory formula. That you count 50 days, and that's Pentecost, in other words. 7 whole weeks or 50 days were to be reckoned from the day of the offering of the sheaf, and then the day of first fruits, Hag HaBikurim, Pentecost, or Feast of Weeks, Hag HaShavot, was to be celebrated. So Shabbatot, he says, signifies weeks, like Shavuot in Deuteronomy 16, verse 9, and like Sabbaton in the Sabbaths, in the Gospels in Matthew 28, verse 1. It signifies weeks, which is evident from the predicate complete, which would be quite unsuitable if it was talking about Sabbath days. You know, what is a complete Sabbath day? What's a half a Sabbath day? It wouldn't make sense. But when it speaks about the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, on this day, 50 days after the first day of Matzah, Israel was to offer a new meal offering to the Lord, made of the first fruits of the new harvest, the wave loaves. So the Omer was waved on the first day of the count, and 50 days later the 2 wave loaves on Pentecost were waved before the Lord. This great ceremony was about the waving of the grain before the Lord to be accepted of the Lord, which symbolizes our being accepted by the Lord our God, our lives. And that was a final proof on this, on the Emphasized Bible by Rotherham, about the word Sabbath also means week. And this is something we a lot of people just don't seem to get in their minds. But in Isaiah chapter 65, I'll show you that in a minute. But here in Rotherham, in the appendix, under the word Sabbath, he says, a few critical remarks on the word Sabbath as it appears in the New Testament may be useful. The word seems to be sometimes an appellative and sometimes a proper name. Day of rest, Sabbath. Second, the term Sabbath is, in several texts, used in the plural in the Greek, where nevertheless it is evident that it means one particular day, not several. In all these passages, the word for the original is in the plural, and yet it is plain that a particular individual day is intended. Languages employing the singular, he says, third, the word Sabbath is also extended to signify weeks, or to signify week. Even in this, there is nothing very far-fetched, since the transition from the idea of rest to that of a rest-bounded period of 7 days is a comparatively natural one. He says, hence the current opinion is probably correct that finds in Luke 18 verse 12 the Pharisee speaking and saying, I fast twice in the week. Notwithstanding, the word for week there in the Greek is sabbaton, in the singular. Since it would appear a very paltry boast to say, I fast twice on the Sabbath. Yeah, right before breakfast and right before dinner. I fast twice on the Sabbath. That's ridiculous. That'd be paltry, he says. That would not be a very meaningful boast. So he says, if not, and if the first day of the week is impossible, what is left but to assume that he meant that he fasted twice during the week? So the word in the plural, as is undoubtedly it is here, meaning week, does it allude to a cluster of extraordinary Sabbath days, on the first of which Jesus arose, in Matthew 28, verse 1, where it says, late in the Sabbath, as it was on the point of dawning on the first of the Sabbaths. Does that make sense? Now try week. Late in the week, as it was on the first point of dawning into the first of the week. Here everything is harmonious. The word sabbaton means, therefore, week. And it can mean week also in the Hebrew. And often does, as it is in Leviticus chapter 23. And Isaiah chapter 65, God says of his people, or chapter 66, chapter 66 of Isaiah, right at the end of the book. Isaiah says, verse 22, as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, says the Lord Yahweh, so shall your descendants and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from 1 week to another, or one Sabbath or 1 week to another, all flesh shall come to worship before me, says the Lord. The King James says week, and the New King James says Sabbath. It can be either one. Shabbaton, Shabbatot, can mean Sabbath or weeks, depending on the context. So, brethren, we are counting the Omer now. How much time do I have left?
2 minutes.
In the whole Bible study?
Yep.
We are counting the Omer now, beginning with yesterday, and today is the second day of the Omer count. And next week I'm going to give you the spiritual significance of counting the Omer, as it is a key to overcoming. That's the Bible study in itself. But this week I'm proving to you and showing you how to count the Omer, when to count the Omer, and why all these churches are wrong. And we need to get back to the faith once delivered to the saints,
Amen.
as Jude says. So let's get back to counting the Omer. Every evening or every morning we should be counting the day and the week. Like today is the first week and the second day of the Omer count. Tonight will be the third day of the first week of the Omer count. And the spiritual significance I will discuss in the next Bible study on the last day of unleavened bread or the following Sabbath day. But you can get this from our website, triumphpro.org, where it has the calendar with the Omer count days there, or triumphpro.com, where we will have articles posted on the Omer count, on the Pentecost page, and also on page 1 of the website. So let's all begin to Seferet HaOmer, which means count the Omer, till Pentecost or Shavuot, as we prepare to meet Christ at the great Shavuot, at his second coming, when he will marry his bride, the church. Hallelujah! Praise God for the Omer.